Are talks with the Taliban the only way to bring peace to Afghanistan? The Taliban's leader was killed in an American drone strike last week, but his replacement threatens to be just as dangerous. Also on today's program, a graveyard at sea. Hundreds of refugees drown attempting to reach Europe from Libya. And in Picture This, it's called the Great Barrier Reef. But for how long? We'll see how Australia's colourful coral is being bleached by warming sea temperatures. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garza. For the second time in under a year, the Afghan Taliban have appointed a new leader. His name isn't overly familiar, but his ideology certainly is. Hibatullah Akhundzada has taken control of a group barely weakened by 15 years of war, which still has the money, the men, and the ability to kill en masse. The Taliban now controls more territory than at any time since the war began in 2001. So while many Afghans have been celebrating the death of former leader Mullah Akhtar Mansour in an American drone strike, the militant group remains a powerful force. Our newsmaker today is the Afghan Taliban, as we ask whether targeting its leadership is a waste of time and if a new attempt should be made at peace talks.
It was a strike that was as quick as it was unexpected. When the Afghan Taliban leader, Mullah Akhtar Mansour, was obliterated by an American drone, he was near the town of Ahmedabad. He was in Pakistan, but near to the Afghan border, an area thought to be off limits for US drones. But in swiftly appointing Hibatullah Akhundzada as the new Afghan Taliban leader, the killing may not have caused the turmoil in the ranks that the Americans had hoped for. It does nothing, however, for US-Pakistan relations.
This drone strike was a violation of Pakistan's sovereignty. We have conveyed our serious concern to the United States on this issue.
Meaning students in the Pashtun language, the Taliban began under Mullah Omar in the mid-1990s. Afghanistan had fallen into chaos after the Soviet withdrawal in 1989. Various Mujahideen factions fought for control. The Taliban began with less than 50 armed men from religious schools in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Spreading from Kandahar, they eventually ruled 90% of the country, until the US-led coalition removed them from power in 2001. In the years since, like any organization, the Taliban has had power struggles and disharmony in the ranks. A year ago, it emerged that the founder, Mullah Omar, had been dead for 2 years, that Mullah Mansour and others had been issuing decrees in his name while hiding news of his death. Mansour worked hard to head off challenges to his ascent. The Afghan Taliban has made strong battlefield gains against government forces in recent months, driving back troops from key positions and launching a string of bombings in Kabul. As a new leader was announced last week, they claimed responsibility for a suicide bombing in the capital that killed 11 people. There was an understanding that a new consensus leader was needed swiftly to quickly re-establish harmony. Mansour himself had refused to participate in the peace process initiated by the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani that included Pakistan, the United States and China. Analysts suggest the change in leadership would do little to shift the group's policy.
The leader dead is a very important point for Taliban. Hardliner Taliban. This Taliban will be stronger inside the Taliban.
But is the decapitation of the Taliban leader likely to improve Afghanistan's security problems? Or could it create more difficulties than it actually solves? Francis Collings, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss whether compromise or combat with the Taliban is the best path to peace in Afghanistan is Michael Semple. He's a visiting professor at Queen's University's Institute for the Study of Conflict, Transformation and Social Justice. And he joins me from Belfast. And in Islamabad is Moeed Pirzada. He's the editor of Strategic Affairs at Dunya News Network. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Moeed, Pirzada, let me start with you. Killing Mansour, was that a blow to the Taliban or not?
It was a blow. It was a blow in the sense, but it was also very confusing because where I am sitting in Islamabad, people, the government, the people in the military failed to really understand that why the US administration took the decision to eliminating Mullah Mansour Akhtar, who was continuously engaged with the Western institution and with the Chinese throughout the past 2 years. Even when Mullah Omar was dead, he was engaging the United States in the name of Mullah Omar. There was a process called Murray process in which the Haqqanis also participated. Both United States and Chinese were actually the observers in July of 2015. And the Taliban and the Haqqanis had offered that Kabul and all the surrounding areas of Kabul can be declared as conflict-free zone in the first step. But then the NDS, the Afghan intelligence, brought out the news that Mullah Omar is dead, and the whole process of negotiation was disrupted. Again, the Pakistanis and Chinese were able to persuade the Afghan Taliban to negotiation table. This was the 5th round that took place, and the reason the negotiations are not going forward was because Taliban had 6 conditions, and 4 of those conditions were very lenient, like accepting the Qatar office, taking the travel ban from the Taliban leadership, stopping calling them as terrorists, and freeing some of the prisoners from Guantanamo Bay. But none of the conditions, 2 of the conditions are strict, like enforcement of Sharia and the exit of the US forces, but those were not serious. United States kept on saying that Taliban should come to the negotiation table without accepting any condition. And in the end, when the negotiation faltered, he was eliminated.
Yeah, but
so
come on, you're talking about accepting these conditions, right? I mean, enforcement of Sharia. Afghans remember what it was like living under them. And also not calling them terrorists when they blow themselves up in markets. What is it other than terrorism? So those weren't just sort of soft things to sort of put on the table and accept from the Taliban, weren't they? I mean, you're suggesting here that they've killed the guy that you could talk to, and now that's sort of decapitated the opportunities for peace.
Imran, what I'm saying is that in any negotiation there is always a maximalist demand, and then there is an agenda which we agree to. Of course, the United States would not agree to acceptance of Sharia within Kabul, within Afghanistan, and they would not immediately agree to the exit of the foreign forces. It's not clear. But there were certain conditions they could have accepted. They had 6 demands for the past 18 months on table, and United States did not agree a single demand. So the fear is this, that United States, or maybe the intelligence community, is looking to create circumstances within Afghanistan that can justify the continued presence of the US troops in this area because of Chinese presence, because of Chinese trade interest, the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So it's very confusing.
Okay, so let's ask Michael Semple.
Trying to do in Afghanistan.
Okay, Michael Semple, is the US, by killing Mansour, trying to justify its existence in the region and trying to create more chaos, as Moeed Pirzada said, by taking out Mansour rather than negotiating?
This is certainly not what I have heard from the US themselves, nor how it looks to me on the ground. I think we can tell a very different story about what has happened over the past year in terms of efforts to get negotiations going. And with respect, I would say that Moeed has provided the most favourable possible view of the Taliban's participation in this. Something which I think most of the Pakistani officials who have been involved would find very difficult to recognize. I considered Akhtar Mansour a superb political and military actor who worked very hard to keep his movement together and worked very hard to dodge negotiations and consistently to put out the message to his own people that we shall not negotiate and we shall continue this fight until we succeed in enforcing Sharia throughout Afghanistan. So I think that where he's looking down from wherever he is now, he'd be delighted to have people describing that as somehow a willingness to negotiate. He consistently refused to provide clear responses to requests to come to the negotiating table, and sometimes he deliberately defied that, and he sent the message out to his own people that we shall not negotiate. I mean, sometimes I think the poor Americans who've been involved in this, you have to admire their patience. They put up with this dodging for an awful long time.
Michael, let me ask you very simply.
Eventually, when
sorry to interrupt you. Finish your point.
Just say, can I explain? But no, I would like to say one point. I think the final straw for the Americans came with the detonation in the center of Kabul of a 1,000 kilo bomb, which killed 60, injured 300, and could have caused massive casualties. When they saw that, they said, this is not serious negotiation by the Taliban.
Okay, point well made. And I'm going to ask you two very, very simple questions. Number one, decapitating the leadership, does it work? And number two, can you negotiate with these guys at all? Michael?
No, I mean, actually, to be honest, I'm very unhappy with this term, decapitating the leadership. We're talking about targeted assassination. Decapitation is actually these days, means something which is not a metaphor. But killing senior militants is not sufficient to solve the problem. It's not adequate. Whether you say, you have to do it sometimes or not, that's another issue. It has some negative effects, some positive, but it certainly does not deliver peace and security. So if anything, it can only be part of a strategy. It's not adequate. It certainly cannot substitute for an effective political strategy. And yes, I believe there is a prospect for talks with the Taliban, but I think it's important to do a careful and fact-based evaluation of the experience of the past year. Whoever you want to hold responsible for it, I think that attempts over the past year to get negotiations going have not succeeded. So if there will be a continuing political process, they'll have to be doing things differently.
Okay, Moeed, Pirzada. The charge from many Afghans and others is that Pakistan at best is soft on the Afghan Taliban. At worst, it's complicit and it supports the Afghan Taliban. Explain the Pakistani position.
It's very important to understand the dynamics on the ground over here. Afghanistan has historically been a country which never had a central government, and it had very serious fault lines between three large ethnic groups, the largest of them being Pashtuns, and Taliban are essentially representing the political struggle of the Pashtun people, which is about 40 to 50%. The second largest group is Tajiks, which is about 23%, and the third large group is Uzbeks, which is about 12%. The power dynamics in Kabul since 9/11 in the form of the bureaucracy, the military, the NDS, the National Directorate of Security is all being controlled by the Tajiks and Uzbeks. This is a purely historical ethnic conflict that has been going on in this area called Afghanistan for the past 100 years plus. I mean, so people make judgments as Afghanistan is in fact is like a Western country, is perhaps like a republic like Turkey, or is like United Kingdom, or is like a modern Western Europe. It's not. It's not like this. So United States is a foreign occupying power, and the power in the Kabul, which they call as the Afghan regime, is actually cannot stand without the power of the United States. If United States withdraws, for how long the Kabul regime will hold? So the solution, the way forward is to bring the Taliban, which have actually ruled the country for almost 5, 6, 7 years, to bring them on the negotiation table, and such negotiations are always hard. Were not the United States bombing Vietnam while they were still trying to achieve a peace? Till the last day when the signature was signed on a truce, the United States continued to bomb Vietnam. So I mean, the United States does one thing for itself and denies the other side the same opportunity. So Taliban belong to Afghanistan. You have to deal with them.
Fascinating developments with the Iran factor, where you have Iran working with the Taliban to create a buffer zone along the border to prevent, I guess, the spread of Daesh in Iran. What do you make of Iran working with the Taliban, Michael?
I think the reason that we're seeing Iran being involved in some level, it's because they see the way things are going in Afghanistan. They're pessimistic about the official strategies and the attempts to get this quadrilateral process and the Taliban to the talks. They're pessimistic about the outcome, and they're trying to do something themselves, at least stabilize the bit near to them. It's what's called hedging. They're trying to hedge. But another factor which encourages the Iranians to hedge is because, rightly or wrongly, they've reached the conclusion that's precisely what Pakistan is involved in. Whether they have their own sources, they interpret Pakistan as being involved in supporting actors in the Afghan war, and the Iranians probably have concluded that, well, if the Pakistanis are do it, we have to do it. And of course, this looks to me like a recipe for continued conflict, not like a recipe for stabilizing the country.
Yeah, it's fascinating because the Taliban's still aligned with Al-Qaeda, but perhaps, losing many young people to Daesh or ISIS, so maybe it's facing a bit of a crisis of relevance. Moeed, final question for you. Along these lines, what do you make of the fact that, Iran, Shia, aligning with the Taliban, hardcore Deobandi, Sunni extremists, hooking up to keep out Daesh? What do you make of that phenomenon?
I think Iran's intentions are very suspect. They're not very clear. It's true that Iranians have engaged Taliban. They have been accused of financing the Taliban. Even Russians have engaged Taliban. There have been publications on Foreign Affairs in the beginning of this year that show. But Iran is definitely interested in having a stakehold in Afghanistan. Iran also thought that the United States will probably withdraw. It will reduce its force presence. Then there has to be a settlement. And Iran, being a regional power, an expansionist regional power, does not want to stay out. And don't forget this thing, that Tajik, which are the second largest ethnic group and the most powerful ethnic group within the Kabul establishment at the moment, are Persian speaking. So Iran has a very strong stake. The country which does not have a stake, which doesn't have a natural stake, but is still has a very powerful presence in Afghanistan, is actually India, which actually sees Afghanistan as a place where it can use as a platform to squeeze Pakistan between its eastern India and its western Afghanistan. So Afghanistan is a very troubled fault line area. It's not going to settle very quickly.
Okay, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Lots of mystery surrounding Hibatullah Akhundzada. Only time will tell, to use the cliche, as to what sort of person he'll be and whether he'll be better or worse than the last guy. Gentlemen, unfortunately, we are out of time. Moeed Pirzada and Michael Semple, thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, as one route closes, another reopens. We ask if the EU is doing enough to ease the flow of refugees crossing from Libya. And in Picture This, an underwater world under threat, why the Great Barrier Reef is depleting faster than first thought. Much of the refugee crisis is focused on the thousands who've escaped war in Syria and Iraq and traveled to Europe. But warmer weather and calmer seas is opening up another familiar route from Libya. For years, thousands have crossed the Mediterranean on rickety boats for Italy and Malta. Their journeys are often risky. The people smuggling networks difficult to stop. And now an all too familiar story is emerging of hundreds drowning in just the last week. So, has Europe focused too much on one crisis and not the other? Yvette McCullough reports.
All my friends told me it wasn't easy. Don't try to get on a smuggler's boat to Europe. When I saw this, I now believe them. It is very bad. But it would have been the same for me if I'd stayed in my country, because I would have been dead.
A deadly route taken by the desperate. Refugees sailing from Africa, hoping for a new life in Europe. Warmer weather recently has seen a surge in crossings. These pictures were filmed by the Italian Coast Guard after this wooden boat capsized last week. Most on board were rescued, but many others haven't been so lucky. In the past week alone, 700 people are feared to have died while attempting the journey from Libya, while 14,000 have been rescued. So far this year, around 46,700 refugees have arrived in Italy. And in the first 3 months, there was a 43% increase in arrivals compared to the same time last year. With summer approaching and the route between Turkey and Greece locked down, it's feared these numbers will increase, and that Italy, who is bearing much of the burden, may struggle to cope. Italy is a key gatekeeper to Europe's southern shoreline. In the past, many refugees arriving from Africa continued their journey on to northern Europe. But with those borders now shut, Italy is feeling the pressure. Earlier this month, there were clashes with police and protesters at the border after Austria announced plans to tighten controls to keep refugees out. While the EU has struck a deal offering Turkey €3 billion in aid to stop the flow of migrants to Greece, it's only allocating €1.8 billion to deal with flows from Africa. Italy wants the EU to push for more deals with African countries to make it easier to send economic migrants and failed asylum seekers back home. But for now, it seems little will deter people from attempting the dangerous journey. Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Milan to discuss the Libyan migration route is Judith Sunderland, Human Rights Watch's Associate Director of the Europe and Central Asia Division. Thank you very much for joining us, Judith. Many of us just saw a picture of a German aid worker holding a corpse of a drowned baby. Awful, awful picture. 700 have drowned. How bad is the situation right now in the Mediterranean? And, was it always this bad, but we just weren't focusing on it? We were looking at the Turkey-Balkans route.
Well, I think it's horrifying enough. That picture that you mentioned is truly heart-wrenching, but unfortunately people have been dying by the thousands in the central Mediterranean for years now. And it's really only in the past several years that the world has focused its attention and that the EU has begun to take, I would say, small and so far insufficient steps to prevent these kinds of horrifying deaths. Certainly late last year, the route in the Aegean Sea from Turkey to Greece opened up in a very big way, and the world's attention was very much focused there. But now is the beginning of the traditional crossing season from North Africa to Italy, and unless more is done to prevent these deaths at sea, we will see more horrifying pictures.
Okay, so there are all sorts of parties involved here. You have the individuals from these countries, you have the countries that they come from, and I guess the leaders and the conflicts in those countries. You have the smugglers. In this situation, who are the human rights violators?
Well, certainly when we're talking about the overcrowded, unseaworthy boats, the direct criminal responsibility lies with the smugglers for sending people on these incredibly dangerous journeys. But the moral and political responsibility, if you will, lies with the European Union for failing first to do more to implement robust search and rescue operations at sea, given that the moral imperative and the very first thing to do is rescue people. And second, because they have failed to open up sufficient safe and legal channels for migrants and asylum seekers and refugees to reach the EU without having to put their lives in the hands of unscrupulous smugglers.
Very briefly, before we go, I just want to ask you about labeling, because many of those crossing from Turkey over to Greece and through the Balkan route are labeled refugees because they're fleeing Syria, Iraq, places that are sort of in active conflict. Many people going from Libya are labeled by most migrants, economic migrants, because they're from Nigeria, they're from Eritrea, and so on. What would you call them? And does it make a big difference?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is I would call them human beings who didn't deserve to die in the horrifying way that over 700 died in the space of 3 days last week. At that point, it really doesn't matter the reasons and the motivations for which they got on the boats. But to be clear, on any given boat, there are as many motivations and hopes as there are people. There are indeed many people on the boats who are hoping to improve their lives and the lives of their loved ones back home. They're fleeing corruption, they're fleeing poverty, they're fleeing bad economies and lack of opportunities. There are many others, including Eritreans and Somalis, who are fleeing deeply repressive, violent societies, and they are seeking refuge in the European Union. The fundamental thing I would stress is that everybody deserves a fair hearing, an individual assessment in order to determine their individual circumstances and whether they have a right to remain in the European Union or not.
Judith, good to talk to you. Judith Sunderland from Human Rights Watch joining us from Milan. Thank you very much. In today's picture this, it's a natural wonder of the world, but the Great Barrier Reef off Australia's east coast is being destroyed by warming sea temperatures. A new study has revealed mass bleaching of 35% of its colourful coral. Let's take a look.
We have a government currently in Canberra who, despite Mr Turnbull's protestations, is not acting on climate change.
Today's newsmaker has been the Afghan Taliban, as we asked whether targeting its leadership was a waste of time and if new attempts should be made at peace talks. The group has appointed a new leader to replace Mullah Akhtar Mansour, who was killed in an American drone strike. But his replacement threatens to be just as dangerous. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.